So you must be disappointed with the result. This wasn't what you were hoping for, was it?
No, we wanted to make a parliamentary breakthrough in the election. I wouldn't describe our numbers as tiny. I mean, after all, it was our contribution that took the independence list vote in numbers beyond the 50% mark, which is quite an important contribution to the election. We got about half as much as the Liberal Democrats, and indeed we outpolled them in the city of Glasgow. So, we didn't do what we wanted to do, but nonetheless, it was a credible result in many ways, and certainly credible effort on 32 amazing candidates. I'll now write a book, I think, about how to form a political party in 6 weeks, or publicise one in 6 weeks, and the do's and don'ts of doing it.
What would the don'ts be?
What would do it? Well, I think there was two issues for us. One was time, and the other was television. Time is 6 weeks to publicise and form a political party and to run the campaign. That was difficult. It was very difficult. But the other one's television. I mean, the campaign for us was set when the BBC refused to allow us into the television debates. And in a COVID-dominated election, when you're restricted as to what you can do in the ground, understandably, then television dominates all. I should just say that all radio stations actually were very fair during the campaign. I'm afraid the same can't be said for the BBC and its decision to exclude us from the debates. I just make the point in Wales, the BBC included they abolished the Welsh Assembly Party for the debates and the news coverage. In Scotland, they excluded Alba, which was our biggest problem.
Now, this has damaged the cause of independence, hasn't it? You said you wanted to form a supermajority for independence, but the SNP haven't got an overall majority in Holyrood, and you haven't got any seats in Holyrood. So how have you helped independence through forming this party?
Very directly, Isabel. I mean, in several seats in Scotland, the SNP only held or won the seat at constituency level because of Alba's intervention. I mean, I'm sitting here beside Banff-and-Buck and Coastal, which was the seat where Alba performed best in the whole of the country. And we got, I think it was 1,200, 1,300 votes. The SNP majority in the constituency section was 700 over the Tories. I think it's almost certain that if Alba hadn't intervened on the list, these people either wouldn't have gone to the polling station because of the lack of appreciation of the SNP's urgency on independence, or certainly wouldn't have voted SNP. Alba asked our people voting on the list for Alba to vote SNP in the constituencies. So in this and a number of other constituencies, the SNP only won, I believe, because of Alba's intervention. And secondly, we couldn't damage the cause of independence because we didn't take any seats off the SNP in the list. But what did happen in the election was our argument that the SNP votes in the list were wasted was magnified many times over, because the SNP got over 1 million votes. 1 million votes piled up in the list section, and managed to elect 2 MSPs from that section of the ballot paper. So unfortunately, although excuse me, we got our argument across to the political journalists and the political cognoscenti and perhaps political activists, we didn't manage to get that argument across to the people in order to make the breakthrough we wanted. We certainly didn't damage the cause of independence. We enhanced it greatly, in my opinion.
So what's your plan now? Is the party going to keep campaigning, or are you going to move on to something else?
Well, the party will be moving on to the local elections in Scotland next year. I mean, we have certain advantages, not the parliamentary breakthrough in the Scottish Parliament that we were hoping for, but we've built a political bridgehead. When we have 2 MPs at Westminster now, that's twice as many as the Scottish Labour Party. We've got 20 councillors, the length and breadth of Scotland. We've got 5,000 members, and we now have a party infrastructure. In fact, we now have the party infrastructure that would have been useful to have 6 weeks ago at start for the election campaign. But so I think for Alba, there's a very important future in Scottish politics, and certainly will be contesting the local elections in Scotland next year. And then, of course, that's a good election for Alba, I suspect, because it's one that's not dominated by television, but dominated by the mobilisation of local activists, which is the key strength that's emerged from Alba.
But potentially not with you as leader. You've said that you're only the interim leader, and that there's going to be a decision at the party's conference in the next few months. Why would you stand down, given you're the best, by far the best known face?
Well, I haven't said I'll stand down. I've just made the point that I was asked. I didn't found Alba. It was founded by Laurie Flynn, the former World in Action journalist. You may know him, Isabel, actually. Laurie and his committee formed ALPA and asked me if I would lead it through the election campaign for the reasons you've said, because I'm a well-known political figure, and ALPA would get noticed in a way that it wouldn't have had otherwise. And that I agreed to do because I thought the constitution, the aims, the intent of the party were fantastic, and I still believe that. But ALPA will elect its leadership at its first inaugural annual conference in June, COVID permitting, because I think it has to be a proper conference, let's call it that, not just a virtual one. And that means I'm sure they'll elect a range of people, not just the leader, but the executive and all the other office bearers. Obviously, I'll consult to decide what I do about that. Mm-hmm. But I can tell you one thing is, though, I will be part of the ALPA campaign, and I will be continuing to support that party
so
in
stay with
whatever
the party.
capacity.
So would you support a wildcat referendum if Nicola Sturgeon calls one?
Well, yes, I would. I mean, that wouldn't be the first court of call, nor should you describe it as a wildcat referendum. It would be a plebiscite legislated for, and I stress the word legislated for, by the Scottish Parliament. And if the Parliament, which is a lawmaking body, passes that, it becomes the law of Scotland. So in no sense could it be described as wildcat. I know one of your guests today was Michael Gove, and if I'm allowed to mention the BBC twice on this broadcast,
I'm sure they're flattered.
It caused something a stir in many ways, incidentally. This not just because you asked me on, but because of the nature of the discussion. This is infinitely preferable to get to the real issues in politics. But Michael Gove caused a stir when Andrew Marr this morning said, "Would you go to the Supreme Court to block such a thing?" And he sort of said no. And that's caused a great flutter of excitement today. I can give you some information on that, because obviously we went through this process back in 2011 and 2012 with David Cameron and George Osborne. It doesn't mean, incidentally, and although some hopes are rising, that the UK government have decided not to try and block such a legislative move by the Scottish Parliament in the courts. But it probably means, one, that Michael Gove didn't want to talk about it, but secondly, it means they're probably judging the political balance between doing it by proxy, getting somebody else to object legally, and doing it themselves. I mean, that's certainly the process that they were going through in the Cabinet Office 10 years ago.
Right.
And given that nothing really ever changes in the Cabinet Office, I suspect they're going through the same process again. So I think Michael Gove's rather bumbling performance on that was actually based on uncertainty, not on whether they would try to stop it, but whether they do it themselves or do it with their agents elsewhere.
How would it have legitimacy, though? Because unionists would surely boycott that vote, so it wouldn't be a representative referendum. Regardless of the legislative position, you wouldn't actually get Scotland's voice in this, would you?
Well, when you say regardless of the legislative position, surely in terms of referendum, it's the legislative position that's important. But just let's step back for a second. I mean, the Scottish Parliament has the right, rightly and correctly, to organise elections in Scotland. The elections we've just seen in Scotland are organised by the Scottish Parliament by legislation. The Scottish Parliament administers, legislates for, it decides, for example, the franchise. In these Scottish elections, 16 and 17-year-olds were able to vote, as indeed were European citizens resident in Scotland. Two big differences between the elections in England. I'm not so certain about the situation of Wales, but certainly 16 and 17-year-olds and European citizens. Now that demonstrates that by legislation, the Scottish Parliament has legislated for, and we've had an election that nobody doubts the legitimacy of, particularly given the huge turnout there's been. Why would it be any different for a referendum on the constitutional future of the country? It's not a question of legitimacy and legislation. It's a question of whether the UK government, or by proxy through some shadowy organisation, will try to block it in the courts of Scotland and in the Supreme Court. That's the issue, Isabel.
Well,
not the proper way to legislate.
In the meantime, Nicola Sturgeon has been invited to join Team UK by Boris Johnson. Do you think she should accept that invitation?
Yes, I don't see any difficulty, and that will be Nicola's inclination. The disagreement I would have with Nicola is not whether she should be joining Team UK or whatever Michael Gove thinks will help him in terms of dreaming up a name for it, but certainly joint efforts against a UK and a world pandemic. Of course they should. I mean, I'd be advocating joining up with Team World in terms of administering vaccines to every country, because as we are aware, this virus is anywhere, it's everywhere.
But it's a trap, though, isn't it? It's a bit of a trap from Boris Johnson, surely.
Yeah, well, traps are only traps if you allow yourself mentally to get sucked in, which is where my disagreement with Nicola is. The disagreement is that I think this is the opportunity to push forward with negotiations on independence, while the trumpet is sounding an uncertain note from Whitehall, who strike me as an excellent opportunity. Now, that doesn't mean the referendum would be next month or even in 6 months' time, because it took 3 years from the 2011 result to 2014 to stage a referendum, and it certainly took 18 months of negotiations with Westminster to set it up. But I honestly don't see the argument for not starting the negotiations on the administration and the referendum or other democratic tests now, as opposed to waiting for some indeterminate period after the pandemic, after the recovery.
Yeah.
If you don't start, you'll never finish.
Now, let's just stick with your, as you call it, your disagreement with Nicola Sturgeon. You told The New Yorker that if you wanted to destroy her, you could have done by now. What did you mean by that?
Well, I mean, that was total misrepresentation. I mean, I was asked a pejorative question. It was a bit like, when did you stop beating your wife? The assumption was I was trying to destroy Nicola Sturgeon, and I scoffed at that suggestion. This was a telephone interview, incidentally, and as I was travelling through Dundee. I just scoffed at it and then I made the obvious point that at the Parliamentary Committee of Investigation, I was asked, I think a number of times by the cross-party committee, should Nicola Sturgeon resign, and each point I refused to say so. I refused to argue that, and I was pointing that out to the journalist. Unfortunately, he didn't include that bit in his copy, and therefore he misrepresenting what I was saying.
So it's not that you have some great piece of information on her that if you wanted to, you would have deployed to destroy her?
No, I mean, what I was pointing out is if I wanted Nicola to resign when invited to say so by the Parliamentary Committee, who by majority, of course, found against Nicola, but that's because, people might argue it's composed of political opponents. So when the political opponents of Nicola said, therefore, should Nicola resign, I refused to say so. And I pointed that out to the journalist. So that wasn't a reasonable or fair interpretation, and I'm delighted you've given me the opportunity to correct.
Oh, I'm pleased I could do that. I'm going to go to Tom in a second, but just one more question from me. You yourself described yourself as no angel, and you were obviously cleared of all criminal charges against you in the trial last year. But you have also had to apologise to women for your behaviour. So do you think it was appropriate for you to stand again?
Yes, I pointed out, as I was repeatedly asked to apologise, that I'd actually done that 10 years ago. And the apology was accepted, not incidentally for what I was accused of, Isabel, but for what actually happened and what the account that, of course, the jury accepted. I think if somebody apologises, as I did at the time, the apology is accepted, and then they're cleared of criminal charges, as I was by a jury, predominantly a female jury, then people should accept the result of the trial and move on. And that's what I've been trying to do in this campaign. I think not without success in terms of talking about the future of Scotland and talking about it in a positive and reasonable way. And I'm looking forward to more opportunities to do that. I don't really see the argument to the contrary. I think that's an argument. Most people believe that if you go to court, you're accused of things, you're cleared by a jury, then that aspect of the matter should come to an end, and people should accept that. And the attempts of various media outlets, such as the BBC, to retry a case, I don't think were particularly edifying in the campaign, and
Alex,
didn't do any credit.
Alex, it's Tom here. One final quick question for me. Just picking up from what you were telling Isabel about how now is the time for Nicola Sturgeon to press on with the negotiations for a referendum. How does that happen in practice when the British government will simply turn around to you and say, we are not negotiating now, now is the wrong time? You know exactly what they'll say.
Well, of course, that was the cusp of this election, Tom. I think, I looked at Michael Gove this morning, and this was quite right about what he's trying to do when he does Team UK stuff and all the rest of it. But he looked pretty rattled, actually, in terms of whether he was prepared to say, we're going to try and block a referendum initiated by Scotland in the Supreme Court. He was uncertain as to what to do. Now, I've said the reasons why I think he was unprepared to say, because they are thinking about getting some organisation out with government to make the legal objection. But just think, Michael Gove's doubt this morning was to say, oh, well, it's not, the Scottish Conservatives got the same number of MSPs as they did at the last election. If Alba had been successful in persuading more of the independence voters to switch to Alba on the list, the Scottish Conservatives would have been decimated, as would the Scottish Labour Party would, and the supermajority would have left Michael Gove even in a more